Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. My guest is Tyler, the Freed Thinker. Hello, Freed Thinker.
Hi, how are you?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
Is it hot in the part of the country that you are from?
It is very hot. So I'm in Southern California, and it is warm. It's almost 100 degrees today. So yeah, it's
Wow.
I'm in
Wow.
air conditioning right now and enjoying it.
Well, I have a daughter and a grandson that live in Southern California, so say
Oh,
hello to
nice.
them.
I will. I will. There's hardly anyone that lives down here, so we
Yes, I
probably
know. I know.
know each other. Yeah. Yeah, when I wait in 4 hour traffic to go see them, I'll make sure to tell them hello.
You'll just wave out the window and just assume that they saw you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to get right into this because I don't know you very well. I've been watching some of your content to try to catch up, and I think you sound like a fascinating person. I saw, in watching your deconversion story, I saw some points where we are very similar and other points where we are very different. Let's start with your background. I understand you did not grow up in a Christian home.
Correct. Yeah. So I grew up in a non-religious home. My mom affectionately, I recall her a retired hippie. She laughs about that. She still is a hippie, but got a little bit more money. But they live out in the woods, and we're not into institutional religion whatsoever. And my stepdad is a retired Catholic. So has none of the religious beliefs, but will still take it very seriously when you go to Catholic church that you need to stay quiet. So I grew up that way. I normally tell the story because people will say, oh, well, when I was a Christian, they'll say, oh, you were indoctrinated. And I'd say I literally wasn't. But they're like, oh, but you grew up in a broadly Christian society that favors that. And there may be some truth to that. But I grew up in a very, very about as deep blue of an area as you could get, up in the Northern California mountains, to the point where when I first converted, my first Christmas, I heard the Christmas carols. I was 20 years old, and I was like, that's what the carols are about. I had no
Mm.
idea, right? So
Mhm, mhm.
I was that unchurched, so to speak, that I really didn't. I knew the basics. They believed in God. I think they believed in three gods. They believed in three gods, and they had someone who died for your sins. That's like all I had. What you get in seventh grade civics. So yeah, not raised religious whatsoever. And so even after my religious conversion, even though I was very, very strong in my belief, very, very sincere in my belief, I parts of the Christian subculture didn't sit well with me
Mm.
a lot.
Before you move on to that, you said something that really resonated with me, and I don't know that I've ever shared this before, but I had a similar experience when I converted to Christianity. I was a sophomore in high school, and our choir director had us sing a lot of religious songs, not religious per se for the most part. For the most part, they were classical songs, but because a lot of the classics are religion based, some of these songs were, but in this song in particular was Amazing Grace.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was singing it before I converted, yeah, it didn't really mean anything to me. It was just a song that I was singing. But after my conversion, suddenly, yeah, it meant so much to me. And yeah, so I know exactly what you're talking about there.
Yeah, mine was Emmanuel. I remember singing
Okay.
Emmanuel, being like, "That's what that is," because I didn't have all the theology back there. I had no idea.
Okay. Go on.
So yeah, so going through church, I wasn't, because I wasn't raised or in Christian subculture. There are a lot of evangelical Christian subculture things that are weird, and I don't think people realize how weird they are. So I kind of had this experience of while I was very devout in my Christian theological beliefs. I was very much. I had a professor, John Kessler, who wrote a book called "Stranger in," or "Stranger in." either stranger or outsider, one of those, stranger in the house of God. And it kind of has this feeling of like, even though I knew I belonged there, so to speak, and was one of them, and actually, very strongly believed it, still kind of had that experience of always kind of being on the outside on some of the cultural things, some of the cultural trappings, and some of the far right conservatism, so a lot of those issues. I always consider myself, I still am kind of a moderate conservative, just structurally in the way I think about things. I tend towards the answer is probably somewhere in the middle of things. And I remember when I went to Moody Bible, and people were like, "Oh, you're the liberal from California." And I was like, if you talk to my California friends, I'm like the conservative friend. So it was just, it's kind of a weird thing to navigate the evangelical Christian subculture. So.
Do you know if Christopher Yuan was teaching there at the time you were there?
I don't.
Okay. Do you know who that is?
I don't.
Okay. He's gay, and he wrote a book about his experience as a gay man, which never would have been accepted among the conservatives that he published it with, except for the fact that he was a professor at Moody. And he advocates for that gay people are called by God to live a celibate lifestyle. But it was him that caused me to realize that gay people don't choose to be gay. Which doesn't get you very far, and the direction that he went is really bad, but at least it gets you that first step. And so I've talked about him a couple of times, and he was a professor there.
My guess is after. So I know I graduated in 2009 from Moody.
Okay.
And
I'm pretty sure he was there then, because that's about the time he wrote that book.
It maybe. So I know that after I left, there was a lot of controversy at Moody, and people thought it was going progressive and going the way of Wheaton, because apparently Wheaton is the bastion of liberalism. There was that, and I know there was like a round of professors that were brought in, and some people were not happy about, and because of more like what was perceived as liberal agendas that were happening there. But I had a similar experience. So I was still very much, I was an ordained elder in the PCA, the Reformed denomination.
PCA,
so Presbyterian in America, so and I did an episode a while back dealing with one of the texts in the Old Testament, dealing with homosexuality. And I remember, and I don't stand by this point now, but I remember, the argument I make was largely that, which is that, look, like, as Christians, we need to stop thinking that homosexual orientation is a sin. We need to stop thinking that it's something that they choose, right? It may be that God calls them to a celibate life. And at the time I thought, well, because they called, anyone who's not married to a celibate life, it's just, it's part of that. But and then I would have this kind of ministerial call and say, okay, but as Christians, be salt and light. Like whatever you think of their lifestyle, if you have, a gay couple next door and they're going through a hard time, bring them food, invite them to your house, offer to watch their kid. I don't care if you think they shouldn't have adopted a child. If they're going through a hard time, love them. And I remember the pushback I got from that. Where, even now I look at it, I'm like, okay, like, but also don't do that, don't be homophobic at all, is the right answer. But even at that time, where I was just basically saying like whatever you think of people, you can still love them and support them and bring them food and be good neighbors and be family to them and all that kind of stuff. And I remember people saying that, you're a gay compromiser and all that kind of, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is, I couldn't understand how I understood the gospel as being, loving to all and forgiving, and that type of that's one of those parts of like Christian subculture. I was like, I just don't understand how we got here from here. So it was interesting. It was an interesting time, as a Christian for 24 years almost. So
okay. Took me almost twice as long. I was in for 42.
Oh, we're out. We're out.
So you got through. Okay, so you must have converted to Christianity in high school.
I was right after high school, so I was 20 years old. I was actually almost 20. I was like the summer between my 19th and my 20th birthday.
Okay,
So
and what convinced you of Christianity?
Yeah, so I was at a state school here in California, and I was a double major in English and philosophy. And I had taken a philosophy class, but it's ontology. The class was ontology, and so the first section of it was classical arguments for the existence of God. My professor, Professor Botterell, was a Canadian atheist, and he went through the arguments, and he was very fair to them. He gave very good treatment. Even looking back, I remember how they're taught, and I was like, oh, he did them well. He was a good representative of them. He gave some of the pushback, but the moral argument, even as he presented it, actually convinced me, not of Christianity, but of theism more generally. So I had gone from kind of a loose philosophical naturalist atheist. I was 19. I hadn't really studied that much. I was raised non-religious, so kind of by default. And so I had become a philosophical theist as I was exploring and thinking about things. And it was in that time frame that I had some friends who were starting to go to church. I went to Chip Ingram's church, Santa Cruz Bible, for a couple of times. Hated it. I hated it. It felt so waspy and so uncomfortable. I hated it. I was like, I can't do it. But then I got invited to like a college age service. It was Dan Kimball. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him now. He's
No, I'm not.
The emergent church movement.
Oh, okay.
And it felt more, I know it's kind of a buzzword, but it felt more authentic. It felt like, it didn't feel like a show. It didn't feel very super waspy. It felt very, people were really just trying to be kind and trying to figure out things out. And it felt more natural to me. And so during that time, I had a religious experience after a service. And so for me, I was already a theist. Then, kind of our conversation beforehand, I was looking for God and what that meant. And so I think that primed
that made
me
you more open to feeling like whatever you felt was probably God speaking to you.
Was probably veridical. And so had that type of religious experience. And then that then colored the way I think that I went around doing philosophy. And, people have asked me what I think of apologetics and apologists now. And yes, there are really bad examples, but I generally try to be charitable and I think a lot of them, not all, I don't even know if it's most, but there are some. And I know that I was very sincere. I was really trying to do good, robust, historic, philosophical, academic stuff. I would read the academic literature. I would read I would go to the academic commentaries. I learned biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew. I mean, I would try to read all the sides on articles. But I think that there's a certain level where, there was a podcast that my partner and I listened to on an ex-Mormon. He said, look, we believed unbelievable things because we were trained to believe unbelievable things. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't so much that I wasn't lying. I wasn't being dishonest or anything like that, but I was disposed towards that direction. And so that colored, the way that I looked and understood the evidence. And so that's where I went for 20 something years.
And then what was the first big crack that started showing you that what you were believing wasn't actually true?
I had kids. And a lot of the platitudes about God being love but in conjunction with some of it just started to feel icky, if I can say it that way. Now, some of the Christians watching, like he was driven by emotion and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't actually that for me. It wasn't an emotional thing. Insofar as our moral intuitions can be non-emotional. But it's the same moral intuitions they want us to use for the moral argument when they say, oh, well, we all have these, moral beliefs. They want us to rely on our moral intuitions. But it was the same moral intuition that I started reading, for example, the book of Job. And I said, look, if I contextualize that, where if the Father is God and any of my children are the Son, there's no sense where that's love. And maybe that's an allegorical story, but then at the same time, God is presenting himself as if that's the type of God that he is. So I had problems like that. I started having problems with some of the issues of classical theism tying up, because I thought that there were much better arguments for the existence of God, philosophical arguments for the existence of God. But I started realizing none of those have a straight line to Christianity. And when I start kind of comparing what I think are good arguments for a God of, kind of the God of the philosophers, that's at odds with some of the things that I have to believe if I believe the Bible is true. But I have reason to believe this one. I don't have reason to believe this one. So which one's going to go? So
what you just said really resonates with the video that I just put out. The video that I released yesterday. J. Warner Wallace is making the argument for the resurrection. And when he lays out his evidence, he says, it's the kalam, the teleological, the moral argument, the argument from consciousness. And he lays out all these arguments for the existence of God and says, okay, because those prove the existence of God, the Bible says that in the beginning, God, therefore the Bible is accurate. And it doesn't work that way. Just because one point in the Bible could be right doesn't mean the whole thing is right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I was a presuppositionalist, for crying out loud, right? But even as a presuppositionalist, I was kind of the fly in the ointment, and I would push back and say, look, guys, like, there aren't really good arguments for Christianity, right? Even if you think these arguments are good, even if the transcendental argument works, right? And I tried to make it work. And I used it in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, right? I used it in my debate with
Matt Dillahunty?
Yeah, I debated Matt Dillahunty. I debated Aaron Ra, right? I debated Eric, not Eric Hernandez. He's the apologist. Although you had that discussion, Eric actually is a good friend of mine. He let me stay crash in his hotel when my hotel canceled. I tried the transcendental argument, but I would point out, like, it doesn't, outside of maybe some philosophical considerations about the one and the many, at best it gets you to a God. At best. So really what you got is like minimal facts arguments about the resurrection and religious experience. That's what you get to Christianity. But I started realizing each one of those I didn't even like as a Christian, because I was like, the amount of spade work that I would even have to do to even start defending this argument is not going to be convincing to people, even if I think the conclusion's true. So it's probably just a bad argument. After I left, I was like, well, it's not only probably not a convincing argument, there's all these problems with it. And now I also don't think the conclusion is true. So I don't think, any of it's good. But yeah, J. Warner Wallace is I don't know. Even when I was an apologist, I always tried to tell people to stay away from pop level apologetics. I was like, there are great philosophical Christian, philosophers and historians and Bible, like, read those ones. Stop. I would tell people, like, stop reading Frank Turek and J. Warner Wallace and Stand to Reason and those guys.
The pastor at the, when I moved from Arminianism to Calvinism, and I went to a non-denominational church, the pastor at that church said the same thing. Stay away from Rick Warren and Max Lucado, and read Wayne Grudem and Mark Knoll and John Piper and Tim Keller. Yeah. Those were the ones that were pushed on us as being, and that's one of the things that held me in the faith for another decade. Yeah. Was I really felt like this was a more intellectual faith, that this had some substance to it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was Reformed, and I was like Presbyterian old covenant theology, like reformed, and it does have a lot of intellectual history and roots to it. I think it's much more robust. I actually kind of jokingly say that, when I was an unbeliever, I would say I'm a reformed unbeliever, and the reason for that was, if I were ever to be convinced to go back somehow, right now, I think, well, the reason why there's all these different theological systems is because there's no consistent systematic theology in the Bible, right? You're just emphasizing different things. There's contrary things. There's a bunch of different theologies that could be present, right? There's no problem now anymore for me. If I had to go back and say which one does the best, if you had to have a system that sits over all of it with the least amount of problems, the Reformed system is I think the most robust and intellectually consistent and all that kind of stuff. The problem is, I just think it doesn't have the benefit of being true.
Yeah, I would agree with you, but the one place where I would really push back is how awful that God would be. That was one of the things that was a part of the first major crack in my theology, was that for the first time, I thought about what my theology meant to the unbeliever, which was that God created them to be an unbeliever. He created them to be fodder for his furnace, and that they never had a chance because they were never called.
Yeah.
And thinking about it in those terms, it's like, what kind of God do I serve?
Yeah, I think we probably had similar thoughts, but kind of in different directions. So for me, what started to take, because I did a lot of debates. I've done a lot of debates, both with unbelievers when I was an apologist, and with other kind of ecumenical debates with open theists and Arminians and all that kind of stuff. And I was Reformed, so I was a Calvinist, right? I was Calvinistic. Part of the issue is, in those debates, they would say, oh, well, if God determined everything, then God's this moral monster, and he's the author of sin and all this kind of stuff. And I did feel the weight of that. I mean, that's not a trivial objection at all. You do kind of have to bite the bullet of, yeah, that's true. If God determined that, then God determined that. And what does that mean, and how do you look like it? But I also, in defending those debates, I kind of started setting up that there's a no-win scenario for Christians, because as bad as that God is, I would say, okay, well, is it better, for example, that God determines that this person, die a terrible death and not be saved, and have morally sufficient reasons, in kind of skeptical theism terms, God has his reasons for determining that because he gets the outcome. It's pure consequentialism. Is that somehow worse than, for example, God, who is all loving, doesn't want that person to die in their sin, could save them, could intervene, could prevent it, but for reasons unknown doesn't, right? And so I started giving these examples. And I was like, okay, imagine, think of something horrific, right? I don't want to trigger, people's, censors or anything like that, or make people really upset, but just think of a horrific murder, right? In one sense, I can almost philosophically conceptualize that, a kind of this consequentialist idea that God can determine something, butterfly effect. I can actually kind of almost conceptualize that. But I didn't know what to do with a God who didn't determine that, didn't decree it, didn't will it in any sense of the way, hated it, could stop it, but didn't.
Sat there and did nothing. Yeah.
Right. And so I started to get to this point where I was like, I feel the weight of this objection that God's determining this, but also at the same time, all these seem worse. And so there's almost, so that's when part of my deconversion, I was like, hey, well, the problem of evil is a problem for all of these systems. And so the issue actually is, if you take out this all-loving God thing, there's no problem anymore. Right. But whereas if you put that in, that's the thing that seems to create all the problems. And so, I kind of had a garbage in, garbage out type of mentality of like, well, that's the common denominator to all these problems that keep these being resolved, and all of the classic theodicies of free will and soul building and all that kind of stuff. They didn't land any weight to me whatsoever.
Did your debates with Matt and Aaron Ra have any effect on your current position?
They were far enough back. No. So my debate with Matt was, I forget the exact proposition, but I think it was, is belief in God reasonable? And I made largely an abductive case that it is. My debate with Aaron Ra wasn't actually directly on the existence of God. It was on the conflict thesis of the conflict between history, the conflict of religion and science. And I basically argued there's not a broad, long-standing conflict of, between, it kind of necessarily between religion and science. And I still hold that view, by the way. But so that was that debate. So they didn't impact my non-belief, but not in any direct sense. I'm still a determinist. I'm still a compatibilist, right? I think all those conditions play some type of conditioning effect down the road. So they would have altered the way that I thought about things, prepared about things, researched things. My kind of in that indirect sense, all of that kind of barrels towards the point where we are now. So probably in some indirect sense, they did.
Okay, now you said you're still a determinist, you're still a compatibilist. Where have you landed? Where are you now?
On like determinism and free will, or on kind of a worldview generally?
Worldview generally.
Yeah. So
and then how those two things fit into it.
Yeah. So I recently posted that it's probably fair to call me an atheist in some sense now. I've been thinking about, I think I generally am slow roll things while I have some time to think about things. I had that realization about 5 or 6 months ago, somewhere around there. I was talking to my partner, we talked about something, and she was like, I think you might, you sure you still believe in God? And I was like, no, I don't, maybe I don't. So I recently said, it's probably fair to start calling me an atheist. Doesn't mean I'm certain that God doesn't exist, but I think I'm at the point where I think something like a God or gods probably don't exist. And I'm far more confident that something like any of the institutional religious concept of God don't exist. Far more certain of that than I am that there is no any type of intelligence behind whatever, even though I think that that's probably not the case. Within that, I would fall under the just a classical compatibilist. I think that all things in the actual sequence are determined, but that having a leeway condition isn't necessary for freedom as a control condition for responsibility. So I think we can be determined and free sufficient, or necessary for responsibility. So
okay,
a Daniel Dennett type of view.
What do you think it is that determines us?
I have no idea. No. It's not divine determinism, whether it's chemical determinism, natural determinism, what prior influences. And part of it is because I don't know what it means to say that my greatest desire doesn't determine the thing that I choose. Mm-hmm. Because I just choose the thing I want the most. Even if it goes against my stronger presenting desire, it's still the thing that I want. It's the outcome I want the most. So I choose it. But I don't think that I necessarily choose those things. There's lots of reasons, but yeah. So,
are your children grown?
No, they're young. I have 6, a 7, and a just turned 9. Well, I have an almost 7 and an almost 8 and a just turned 9. So
okay. Do they attend church? Are they being raised as in a religion?
So we have split custody, mm-hmm. And in my household, no. And in the other household, kind of, but kind of like a Creaster type of thing, where they go on the high holy days.
C&E Christians.
Yeah, and maybe once or twice throughout the year otherwise. But besides that, no, not really. Okay. But before my deconversion, I was catechizing them. So if you ask my oldest son, what is the chief end of man, he would know the chief end of man is to glorify God and
enjoy him forever.
Yeah. Right? So I mean, I catechized them through the smaller catechism, so they would know, so it's in their framework somewhere. Which has it
affected them at all that you've gone through these changes?
They were young enough, and I think still not interested in religion enough to notice. Although sometimes it has been interesting. My older son has had the hell scaries recently, And so he said something, and he's like, because I don't want to go to hell. And so, he's 9. I try not to, he's not going to follow all the arguments or anything like that. But I've had conversations with him, like, but like, I try to say, look, do you know that I love you? And he says yes. And I said, do you think there's anything that you could ever do, even if it would hurt our relationship? Do you think there's anything that I would ever do to punish you like that, just forever and ever and ever, and just to punish you? And he said, no, there's no way. You love me too much. And I said, okay, I think that if God exists, it's gotta be like that, right? Like, don't worry about it, right? Like you're a really good kid. You're really kind. You're really loving, right? If there is a God who is all love like that, I'm sure he's going to love you. So, I don't know. I don't know. I'm still navigating how to be a parent and how to navigate these things. I don't know if that was a right or a wrong answer, but so it does make for some conversations like that every now and then.
Have you seen my conversation with Joe Ensley?
No, I haven't.
Joe Ensley is a reformed apologist. He's an amateur apologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I had him on the show, and I asked him the question that I asked of all reformed is, if you found out that God had not called one of your children, are you fine with your child going to hell? And he said, yeah. I mean, that's God's decision. And in the show, I told him, don't ever let your children see this.
Yeah.
Because I think it could be damaging to them to know that their father feels this way about them. And he totally did not get it. He was, well, why not?
Yeah.
He totally didn't get it.
Yeah. I mean, there is, look, but bless their heart. There is kind of in the Reformed tradition that if the answer is consistent, it's good. And so logical consistency almost takes priority over a lot of other things. Not almost, it does take priority over a lot of other things, just in the way that they think about theology. And so I remember reading, it was R.C. Sproul was talking about his mentor. I can't remember his name. He was a big professor down at Reformed theology. Anyways, and he John Gerstner. And he has this this kind of quip where he says, where someone asks him, like, when you're in heaven, won't you be sad about your loved ones in hell? And his answer was chilling, but consistent. And that is basically, well, no, because I will be so Christ-like, I will understand that they deserve it. Consistent, entirely consistent. Just really horrific, and really, really cold-hearted, but consistent.
Yeah. Okay, couple questions from viewers. Mark Caesar says, an interesting question is, with everything that happens in our day, could we have made a different decision to do things? I think that's the definition of determinism.
Well, it depends. Oh gosh, we could go way down rabbit trails here. It depends on what you mean by could have, right? So in the philosophical literature, there's all this different kind of conversations about what you mean by could, right? And you have categorical senses of ability, which is I think what most people mean. I could do A or not A. I have this categorical ability. Most philosophers who are compatibilists think that that's not necessary for freedom, but this, what's called a conditional ability to do otherwise, is the important thing. That if I had wanted to do differently, would I have had the capacity to do it? And that's the key thing. Because if I had wanted to do something, but you had a gun to my head, or I was physically restrained, then I still might be, I could be guilt. I could be not blameworthy, because now I'm being forced. I wouldn't have been able to, even if I wanted to. And so when you start getting into determinism, you start getting into, reading Fisher and Ravizza and all of those, you start getting into all these questions about, like, how much control do you have to have for your control condition? How much are your reasons responsive? It gets into all kinds of, I think it's fascinating, but very, very dull philosophy.
Okay, I've been holding this question for quite some time, so it's a little off topic from where we are right now. He says, my deconversion from Christianity was science-based. To me, Big Bang seems more realistic than some sky dude creating the universe in 7 days. Did science have anything to do with your deconversion?
Yes, but not in that way, right? So remember, I was almost 20 when I became a Christian. I came in believing in evolution. I had a short little stint where I stopped because I thought that to be consistent, I couldn't. Mm-hmm. Probably like a 1.5 year period of my time, I left it. And then from there on out, I kind of just was like, the Earth's old. I was reading other things. I was like, I'm just going to stay out of the evolution creation debate. I don't really think it's important because I had a reading. I had a reading of Genesis 1 that was much more like Heiser or Walton, where it's really, it's a liturgical text used to polemicize other ancient Near Eastern worldviews. And so that's why it was borrowing on these other myths and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't think the science and evolution debate was really that important.
So you did not accept Adam and Eve as being literal people?
So I didn't really know. So I thought that what likely was happening, this is how I looked at it, what likely was happening was that Adam and Eve were the first, not the first humans, but they were likely the first covenant representatives with God. And so as the covenant heads, I didn't need them to be the genealogical fountainheads of humanity. Just the covenantal representatives of humanity. That was all that was needed for the theology to work. And so I didn't really get into that. Where science did play, I think, a part in it is, and this is going to be wildly unsatisfying to Christian apologists, but anyone who isn't in there will probably nod. It is just that general sense of, I don't need any of that to explain any of this. And any time a divine explanation is posed, as I started to kind of get out of it and started to, get more incredulous and research things a little bit differently, I found that every time I started to scratch an argument, right, it just bled pseudoscience. That's just what was under the surface almost every single time. And so, I still, like, I was on Real Seekers earlier today, and I was like, look, at the end of the day, there's the old saying, if you had better arguments, you'd use them. If at the end of the day, the best evidence you have is a bunch of non-specialists doing questionable science, building up conspiracy theories about the experts who actually are doing scientifically reviewed work, I can't imagine how an omnipotent, omniscient God who desires a relationship with all of us wouldn't do better than that. And so there is this kind of like underlying incredulity of like, just like the science is just better than that. Right. And so all that's just doesn't mean that it's false. It just means that it's kind of like, not really needed any of that. And probably not helpful in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot more we could go into with this, and I do have some questions I'd like to ask. However, for the sake of time, I do want to talk about your podcast as well. So let's move on to that. How long have you had your podcast?
A long time. I think I started doing, so I've been doing apologetics way back in like the forums days, and I was writing blogs and articles for LimeWire. That was back in like 2001. I think I started recording a podcast and doing podcasts. I was at Moody. So 2008 probably is when I was doing initial podcasts. And then I started doing YouTube, which I've almost entirely transitioned to. I don't really put anything out on the podcast anymore. So the YouTube channel, I think I started doing in 2000. I started being a guest on this old thing called the Council of Google Plus. Would basically be on Google Plus, and they record and put shows out. And that was back in like 2015, 16. And then I think I started my own YouTube channel. Didn't really publish much, somewhere a little after that.
So you've done your entire journey on YouTube.
Yeah, so my deconversion, it's all been on YouTube. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I watched your video on your deconversion part 1 and your deconversion part 2, and both of those were about a year ago.
Mhm.
Um, were a lot of your viewers surprised at how much your views were changing?
Yeah, it was hard. The I did have a lot of people. I was yes, I had a lot of people who were surprised. I mean, I had done a debate 6 weeks before or something on limited atonement,
Mhm.
defending limited atonement, and so to go from that and then a deconversion announcement, uh, which, I get. But again, anyone who knows me knows I do have that kind of that conservative impulse, not necessarily in the political sense, but in the sense of I'm not going to rock the boat and I'm not going to make this announcement on a whim. And so for about a year beforehand, and I said it in my deconversion, I was like, I've been deconverting for about a year. Started having intellectual doubts and some other things and going through all of that. But I was still almost like in a Pascalian sense. I was still saying, look, this could be a dark night of the soul. I'm going to continue to walk in faith and I'm going to trust in Jesus, even when things look bleak and look bad. And so there was a sense where I was actually doing my darndest as a Christian, a professing Christian who still had faith, to remain. And there's an old saying of, to seek God where he is found. And so I was still trying to seek God and to not speak ill and all that kind of stuff and to really, have faith. And then there came a point where I could no longer have faith in faith, right? I couldn't do that anymore. And at that point, that's when I was like, well, now I don't even have faith. I don't even have trust in Jesus anymore. Now I got to say something because it'd be disingenuous for me to continue on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That makes sense. So what is the goal of your show?
Now sounds terrible. I don't have a good mission statement.
Okay.
For a long time, it was doing apologetics. It was sharing kind of the research that I was doing through my master's program. What I was researching, right? So I was trying to kind of elevate conversations and increase, the academic awareness of Christian apologists and things like that. Now, I just really enjoy this shit. I just enjoy having these conversations.
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
enjoy talking to people of different views, even ones that I think are wrong. Sometimes I'll sit on fences, so to speak, where, I'll look at the Christian and be like, guys, that's a terrible argument. Look at the atheist and be like, guys, don't fight ignorance with ignorance. That's also a terrible argument. And so, I enjoy having very productive conversations as much as I can. I enjoy learning through new things. I had a polytheist on the show for the first time, which was great, super enjoyable. So I now just enjoy having interesting conversations. And I still enjoy thinking about things and turning things over and tearing things apart and challenging other people to think about things. And so as I'm having conversations with someone, an apologist gives me an argument about, some type of free will theodicy, I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about why that's probably not a good argument and go into that. So I still just enjoy these types of conversations and thinking deeply about these things, even though, and I will admit, kind of the long-term passion of it's gone, not in a bad way, but I don't think anyone's eternal destinies are on the line anymore. And so now I do it more as like a hobby than a ministry, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. I'm in the same boat. Although in one respect, I kind of sort of consider what I do to be a ministry in the sense that I, led Bible studies and, did so much to try to bring people into the kingdom of God that I almost feel not really an obligation, but I kind of feel like it's almost my duty to try to undo some of the damage that I did.
Yeah. I understand. I did a series on slavery because I was a Christian apologist, right?
Mhm.
And not to toot my own horn, I think I did it as admirable of a job as an apologist for that could do. But now I see some people actually like using or citing my work, and I have to jump in and almost feel compelled sometimes, like, that was my influence, like mea culpa. I feel really bad that I like put that in the world. And so I, want to undo some of it and undo some of the harm. And so there is part of that that's there. And I also think that there is part of these discussions that I still want to improve the dialogue and the intellectual rigor of the conversations that happen. And so while I was a Christian apologist, I would have some of these in-house debates about problems of evil and theodicy, like free will theodicies and soul-making theodicies. And I would say, guys, this is why these are bad arguments. Don't use those anymore. And I still have some of those conversations because I want better dialogue and better discussions, and for people to stop using those really, really terrible arguments.
We have a suggestion for a mission statement from you.
All right.
From B.S. Lewis. I just want to sin.
Obviously. Yeah. That's right. So this one's funny, actually. When I left, lots of Christians were wonderful, right? I mean, they weren't all terrible. What I've started calling, assholes for Jesus, right? There were lots that are wonderful, but there are some don't know me, don't know anything about me, all that kind of stuff, and they're like, oh, he just wants to sin, and that's why he left. And I was like, look, you don't know anything about who I am, my life, anything like that. And I had someone, they started noticing that I started cussing, right? Because whatever. And they're like, do you think that you left so that you could cuss? And I was like, no, that's such a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Like, no, I left, so I therefore don't have as many of these concerns anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it is what it is. So when people, I know people have left and they leave, and right now, I'm not technically married. I cohabitate with my partner. We're never going to get married. Neither of us want to get married again. But we're going to live together. We're pretty sure we're going to live together for the rest of our lives. And so people are like, oh, like he left just so he could like sleep with his girlfriend. And I'm like, no, I don't have the same, worldview that you have anymore. That wasn't the impetus to leave, but yeah, I'm not a Christian, so I don't do Christian-y things anymore.
I don't cuss a lot, but when I do, it's a sign that I'm really pissed.
Yeah.
But the one time I let loose with some blasphemy was because Frank Turek posted a video of a woman saying that unbelievers cannot blaspheme. Because they are unbelievers, anything that they say is not blasphemy. And so I decided to test him on that. And I let loose with some blasphemy in a response to his post, and he blocked me. I said, I guess he doesn't believe his own post. doesn't believe
the rhetoric. Yeah, I mean, I generally, I'm not out here, cussing constantly. I like the well-placed cuss word for emphasis every now and then,
right?
Or really upset about something in LA traffic. But generally, I still, because I want to foster productive conversations, there is a sense where I want to keep bridges open. And I want to have productive conversations. I'm not out here. I don't think Christians are stupid. I don't think Christians are, all evil people. I don't think they're all, I don't think they're all anti-science, right? I don't think those things. And so I also don't want to kind of perpetuate some of those stereotypes. But I am going to push on the ones when you are making a stupid argument. I'm going to call it a stupid argument. And so, but I try not to be overtly offensive to anyone who has a different view. Sometimes I can't help it, because if there is an objection, I'm like, this doesn't make sense. It will offend sometimes, but it's never.
Okay. Here's a really good question. How did your non-religious parents react when you became an apologist, and how are they reacting to your deconversion?
Yeah. I mean, my non-religious parents, they're the kind who are just going to love me and be supportive. I could have been like, I'm going to be a Mormon missionary and go off on my mission, and they would be like, we love you so much. They would let me pray at Christmas dinner, even though no one else was really, they would ask me to, because they were trying to make me comfortable. And so, they're very wonderful, warm people. I think obviously they weren't fans of the things that I believed. But they also kind of were like, we raised you in a certain way to follow your heart and to follow what you love and follow what you believe. And so, they were supportive. Since coming back, for all kinds of reasons, religion did a lot of damage in my personality and my psyche. Not like in major psychosis ways, but in ways where I was very muted compared to who I really am. And so, and much more hidden and much more closed to people and much more worried about perception because you're always evangelizing. And so it kind of had that, you generally joke about like, church culture, and everyone has to, you put on your Sunday best, all that kind of stuff. And life is generally like that the more religious you become. So when I deconverted, my family was also like, and I was also in a not very healthy marriage. And so some of that played into it. And so when I left those, I left one then the other. My family, literally almost verbatim, every single one of them was like, we're like, welcome back. It's good to see you. It's nice to see you smile again. Right. All that kind of stuff. So it wasn't so much the religion, non-religion thing. It was the byproduct of what it did to me personally. That they're happy. They were concerned when I was going in and happy when I came out.
Okay. We have another question. How do you feel about how Braxton Hunter went off on you when you left?
I don't remember Braxton Hunter going off on me when I left.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of that either. I assumed that you were. Whoops.
So Braxton Hunter he's a friend of mine, actually. I really like Braxton. And during my deconversion, so I always mention that there were people who knew this was coming. And Braxton Hunter was one of them. He didn't know that I had deconverted, but he knew he was one of the people I was like, I'm doubting, I'm having major questions. Like, here's the issues that I'm like, he was one of the people I talked to when I was struggling through my divorce. Like, Braxton it is frustrating when I watch people and they talk to Brad and they're like, oh, Braxton is like a, fake. I know Braxton, one of my favorite humans. He's a very good man. And so I don't remember him going off. He did have some hard words for me sometimes, but I don't know if I would classify that as going off. But we just disagree about some things, and that's okay. But I have nothing but love for Braxton Hunter. There are some other people that if you say some names on, I would say, well, they slid solidly into the, into the a-hole for Jesus, hashtag a-holes for Jesus. But he was not one of them.
One of the things that he said that I really I found really offensive. He wrote a pamphlet and he was trying to explain how apologetics is for everyone. And he said, even if you're a 14-year-old boy or a 60-year-old woman, you can learn these things. And I said, why do you think so lowly of 60-year-old women?
Yeah.
Why do you think we're less intelligent than you are?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, it's one of those, I 100% agree with you. They're hard. Sometimes I wonder, and I don't know if this is the right response, or there is a certain point where it's a bless their heart moment. they don't realize kind of the patriarchal system that they're in, and you just can't see it till you're out.
I think what he fails to see is that because there are so many denominations that exclude women from leadership, that's the reason that most women don't go to seminary. It's because seminary is supposed to prepare you for a job that most women are going to be excluded from.
Yeah.
It's not that we're less intelligent.
Yeah, unless you want to go into an academic career, because you can go to seminary and go to an academic, but people don't want to do that. And I think, for Braxton, I can't read his mind, but in that type of context, whether he meant it or not, there's almost that underlying assumption of he's thinking a housewife right? That's what that's the whether you're a child or you've been a stay-at-home mom for right, that, but without realizing like how patronizing that
Right.
is.
Exactly.
Because that's just, but again, they can't see it. You just can't see it until you're out of it. Almost, it's like, I talk to some people who, not to make this even more controversial, but some people who are like, oh well, there's no institutional racism.
Oh gosh,
And I'm
yeah.
like, oh my God, like, even if you don't think that, the fact that like the socioeconomics were formed this way, like you can, like, until you get out and understand it, you won't understand why what you just said is so ignorant and offensive at the same time. And so I have a hard time blaming people for that, because they're raised in that and they don't know any different, while also thinking it's gross at the same time. So I don't know.
Omega Weapon clarified a bit. He said Hunter made a video about how bad people are if they leave, and he inferred that it was about you, but I could be wrong.
Oh, I do remember the video. He was I don't think he was trying to say that I was bad. He was trying to, when I deconverted, I was at like the tail end of several, I wasn't famous, right? But in apologetic circles, I was somewhat known. And so I was in a kind of a string of somewhat known or pretty famous deconversions. And so his video, I kind of watched it and thought, well, this is we got to stop the bleeding and make a press statement type of video. But I don't think it was directly like, I was probably part of the catalyst, but I don't think it was directly about me.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so before we go, what is the future of your channel? Do you intend to go in the same direction? Do you plan to change the direction a bit? What do you have coming up?
Yeah, so it's probably going to stay a similar direction. I enjoy having some of these conversations. I am very busy in life with work and kids, and love traveling, and so I've tried to also enjoy my life, which I didn't do for a long time. And so a lot of the content I'm putting out is, I'll see, I still watch a bunch of, apologetic videos. And so I'm starting to do a lot more like response videos, because I just don't have the time. I used to write transcripts. I would, have a 20-page, academic transcript with footnotes where I got it from the research articles and all that kind of stuff. And then my podcast was largely, I was reading through effectively research papers. Or actual research papers that I had submitted for my master's degree. And so I don't have the time to do that anymore, as much as I wish I could be that rigorous. And so I still like to do shows and respond to, some apologists and some not. So you had Godless Engineer on. By the way, I don't dislike John whatsoever. I disagree with him, and I didn't agree with him whatsoever. But if you talk to him, tell him I think he's actually a pretty cool dude.
Okay, I'll tell him that.
If he's watching, John, I don't dislike you whatsoever. I think you're wrong. I think you should jump ship from Carrier, but that's a whole different thing. But so I'll try to find videos that I think are interesting in these kind of this whole sphere of discussions of theology and the Bible and Christianity, and do reaction videos, have a couple guests on, and have some conversation. It'll probably continue in that way for as long as I'm alive. I really enjoy these conversations. And so yeah.
Do you have a guest lined up for an upcoming show?
I don't, because you were actually my last stop. I am fully booked with either travel or trips with the kids or certain things all the way up through end of October.
Okay.
And so anything I do for the next like 3 or 4 months is really going to be like I saw a video and I'm going to do it off the cuff. Like I can carve out an hour and get it. But that's going to be the next, probably the next season of this for a little bit of time. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. We are out of time. It has been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
And thank you to all of you in the chat for your comments and questions. Thank you to all of you who are watching this in the future. Next week, my guest is going to be Ken Daniels. And if you noticed me scrolling through my phone, I was trying to remember, I know Ken Daniels is either an ex-Mormon or an ex-JW. And I tend to think of those two groups as being the same. And I was trying to find information on which one it was that he was, and I couldn't find it. But he is an atheist. He's someone that I met through the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and I think it's going to be a really good conversation. So come next week to meet Ken Daniels.
Awesome.
And thank you so much, Tyler, for coming on. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
Live your life.